In this video, I want to talk about the biggest misconception about GPT 5.2 Codex and also show you why I'm building my own Rolf loop instead of relying on third-party tools like the Claude Code plugin or other open source implementations. I want to first of all show you this tweet by Forsten where he says that GPT 5.2 is very good, and then Sam Altman asks him what's been working well and what would you like us to improve in 5.3. And the response he gave here made me think that a lot of people, including Forsten, and this is no disrespect towards him, but I think that he is not really understanding how to use the GPT 5.2 model in the correct way. So he says here it's very smart over long context, which I find impressive, but what I love to see is increased eagerness to use tools, less I didn't run the test, here's how you can run them, and better adherence to agents.md files. And then he talks about ChatGPT, which I'm going to skip over. Like you saw in that tweet, and by the way, he's not the only one who has this problem with GPT 5.2 Codex. The problem is usually that the model is not eager to use tools, it requires very clear instructions to do something, it is lazy, and it asks too many questions. So when you say go do something, the model tends to ask you for a lot of guidance before starting to do things. And what I think that people get wrong about Codex is that all of these things are not negative aspects to it, they are actually positive. Or I should say, this is just the way the model was trained, so we need to know how to actually prompt the model correctly so that it does what we want it to do. And I think that the biggest reason for people having this idea about Codex is that we're all used to using Opus and Sonnet. And then we try to do quote-unquote Claude things instead of quote-unquote Codex things. Because of the different way these models were trained, it means that there's a different way to work with them, not only when it comes to the tools that you give them, but also when it comes to the prompts. One great example that I can give you is that I was trying to use superpowers, which I first started using with Opus and Sonnet. Then I decided to migrate all of my tools and workflow over to GPT 5.2 Codex, and I gave it a try first of all with the Codex CLI and then with OpenCode. And the results were terrible. It was just not working at all when compared to Claude Code. Now, if you take a look at the description here, it says that this is an agentic skills framework and software development methodology that works. But just a couple of weeks ago, this about section actually said that this was a project built for Claude. And only later did the creator of this project, which I'm not trying to bash him for this, but only later did he add the Codex and OpenCode integrations. This means that all of the skills, all of the prompts, everything was built around Claude Code, around the Opus and the Sonnet models. So while later the project got a Codex and OpenCode integration, this meant that while the models were able to invoke the skills were not built with GPT 5.2 Codex in mind. So to me, the problem felt like I was using Opus 4.5 prompts with GPT 5.2 Codex. Now, one thing that you might be thinking is that quote-unquote prompt engineering is not a thing anymore because now everyone is talking about context engineering, and that is just not true. Yes, it is true that while prompt engineering in the traditional sense doesn't work anymore to do those kinds of silly tricks that we did to force the model to do something, it's still something that is very relevant and important to do when you are working with a model. So much so that even OpenAI released a GPT 5.2 prompting guide. And this guide has a lot of gems that are important if you are building prompts for GPT Codex instead of Sonnet or Opus. As you can see here, it has things about preventing scope drift. It also has things about long context and recall, handling ambiguity and hallucination risk. And I think that handling ambiguity is very much tied into the point that I was trying to make when we were taking a look at the post by Forsten, where he said that the model simply doesn't want to run tests, and there the problem lies in us not knowing how to correctly prompt the model. So the solution really is very simple. You need to take a look at this prompting guide and you need to understand how to do things the way that GPT 5.2 Codex was trained to do them, and then you won't have any kind of problem. The first thing to understand about GPT 5.2 Codex is that it requires very clear prompts. There can be no ambiguity and you need to specify everything in a very detailed fashion. You need to tell it what to do, what not to do, when to do it, when not to do it, and similar instructions that will help the model know when to make a decision at the right time. And if you're now thinking that Opus or Sonnet don't require this kind of detailed prompts and they can actually do things without us having to specify things with so much detail, I think that you might be looking at things from the wrong perspective. Just think about it for a second. If you want to be able to have a model do a run where it implements a bunch of different tasks, let's say for 1 hour or 2 hours, you want the prompts to be very specific. You want the guidance to be very clear. This means that you can automate a lot of work, while in the case of Opus or Sonnet, you're going to make a lot of decisions, and then you're going to look at those decisions and you're going to think, this is actually not the thing that I wanted. While in the case of GPT 5.2 Codex, since these prompts are so specific and they require us to actually include all of this specificity in the prompts, it means that it's always going to make the right decisions according to what you want. This obviously means that you're going to have to put more work up front to build these prompts, to build all of these workflows, but in the end, it's going to pay off. And besides prompting, you can also use guardrails to take this to the next level. You can use something like extensions from the Pi coding agent to add, for example, hooks that forces GPT 5.2 Codex to do something. And while I wrote here hooks, with the right tool, the sky really is the limit, and you can build anything that you need when it comes to guardrails. I made an in-depth video about the Pi coding agent CLI, and I'm going to leave a link in the description down below if you want to go watch that. But essentially, extensions are a way to add functionality to the CLI and extend it. And the thing that is most important and relevant for what we're talking about here is the event interception, where you can block tool calls, modify results, and even customize compaction. This is great because let's say that you have the execution of a plan that you want the model to go through. You can, for example, enable a hook inside of the CLI that forces the model to only end that loop when it runs the test. Obviously, this is an extreme example, and I think that you can get there only with prompting, but if you're having a tough time making sure that the model follows instructions, this is a great way to do that. Finally, I want to show you a minimal version of the Ralph loop that I'm building with the Pi coding agent CLI, which combines to-do list, JJ, and a hook that prevents the model from stopping the loop if all the to-do items are not yet done. This also means that each to-do item is tied to a JJ revision, and the model can also pass along an ID for the bookmark related to what it's currently working on. The task the model went through in this session was to create a skill for debugging errors. And when I first started creating this skill, the model was simply not cooperating at all. And the funny thing is that the biggest problem I was having is that the model wasn't running tests, which is the exact same thing that Forsten talked about. But after creating different versions of this skill, I was able to make it go through all of the steps without any problem by combining first of all of the gems from the GPT 5.2 prompting guide, and also combining that with a to-do right extension that I've created for the Pi coding agent, along with the hook that prevents it from stopping its loop without first finishing all of the to-do items. And as you can see here, it went through each one of these steps perfectly. It didn't skip anything, and it ended up creating exactly what I wanted without me having to interfere during the process. Obviously, if I were using Opus or Sonnet, maybe the prompts wouldn't have needed to be so detailed, but I actually prefer it this way because now I know that I have this workflow that the model will always go through and never deviate from it. So this is it. Hopefully this video taught you how to think about GPT 5.2 Codex and why so many people complaining about it is actually a misunderstanding on how to use it. Because everyone got their first glimpse into how to use coding agents with Opus or Sonnet, now we're stuck in our ways of doing things in the quote-unquote Claude code way, instead of just trying to think about how to use the tools that we have available to ourselves in the correct way to accomplish the things that we want to accomplish. And finally, I encourage you again to take a look at the video that I made about the Pi coding agent CLI, because I think it is a great tool, and it is, in my opinion, the perfect harness to work with GPT 5.2 Codex because it is so extensible and it allows us to build these tools around it. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you on the next one.